Welcome to the Catalyst Sale Podcast. Whether you are a sales professional, not in sales but interested in helping people solve problems, or a founder CEO who is looking to grow your business, you'll find practical tools, stories, and experience you can apply to your role. I'm your host, Jody Mayberry, and I'm here with Mike Simmons, co-founder of Catalyst Sale. Hello, Mike.
Hey, Jody.
Okay, Mike, I know we get listener questions and whatnot, but I've got one for you, or a topic. I don't know if it's a question directly, but I know you have experienced this too. Being the host of podcasts, I get solicitations often. Just people that don't know me, they found my show somehow, iTunes, whatever, and then they reach out and say, I'm the perfect guest for your show. And how often do you get those for the Catalyst Sale Podcast?
On a positive note, we're getting them more and more, which means I think we've passed into the next level of the game, which is that the one where people start to recognize you and they feel comfortable sending emails and requesting time to be on the show. So I feel like we've moved it. We were hanging around at level 5, and now we've moved to level 6 in the game.
Now that is the good thing about it. I'm glad you mentioned that. The first few of those that you get, you're like, all right, people are noticing the show and they're asking to be on it. And then as you move up to level 7 or you stay in 6 long enough, you start to notice something about all the emails you get with people requesting to be on the show. And that's that for one, there's a lot of similarities, almost to the point where you would say they're just cutting and pasting. And there's nothing more. And they don't care whether they get on the Jody Mayberry Show or the Catalyst Sale Podcast. They're just throwing these out there and seeing who bites.
Wait a second. What you're saying is people copy and paste emails and reuse them over and over again?
Well, that's my suspicion. Can you believe that might be happening?
I'm shocked.
But then there's this other element to it. There are people that copy and paste, but then there's a whole nother level where they personalize by copy and pasting, but then they will insert the name of your show rather than I'd love to be on your podcast. They'll say, I'd love to be on the Catalyst Sale Podcast, or they will put a link to a particular episode of your show. Now, they're just using the same email they sent to 100 other podcasters, but they have inserted the proper words and links. So that's the other level to this.
That reminds me of the game we used to play on these long road trips. Do you remember Mad Libs?
Oh, yes. My kids still enjoy those.
And you could create these cool stories. You just add in like write in the noun, write in a verb, write in an action verb. And before you know it, then you've got this story that you can read through and everybody laughs because a dog jumped over something. But wow. So now we're talking about the Mad Libs approach to sending out emails.
I love how you tied that in, but I will tell you that the Mad Lib approach to emails compared to my kids doing Mad Libs on a car ride, the emails reference flatulence a lot less than my kids and Mad Libs.
Is that a function of what you feed your kids or something else?
I don't know. It's just what they put in their Mad Libs. I don't question it. I would rather not know the answer.
Awesome.
So what I'm interested in here is, what if I don't know you, but I'm a fan of the Catalyst Sale Podcast, and I think, gosh, I would love to be on that show because I believe I have something that could really help the audience. Tell me more about this, because I think this discussion is going to apply not just to getting to be a guest on a podcast, but to reaching out and prospecting and selling overall, because that's really what they're trying to do. They're trying to sell themselves as a guest on the Catalyst Sale Podcast. So we've got 2 types of emails I talked. One is the cut and paste. One is what you referenced to being the Mad Libs approach, where you just change out relevant things like Mike Simmons instead of Hey You, and Catalyst Sale instead of your podcast. But then there's a third approach, and one that's personal. And I'm sure you've maybe gotten a couple of those too, Mike. So let's just talk about that, on how people approach you about being on the show and what that means in sales terms.
Yeah, and I think you can look at this, like you said, It's similar to any kind of outreach a sales rep might make to a customer or a prospect or potential customer, especially cold outreach. Many of these things are cold outreach that I'll get or that you'll get relative to the podcast. And, as you're a sales rep that's out there and you're conducting outreach inside either your territory or your client base, your named account list, whatever it may be, that first email may be a cold email. So one, copy paste, cut and paste doesn't really work for me. And I know we've talked about that a couple of times on the podcast. One challenge you run into is a rep gets an email that works pretty well for them and is getting a good response rate, and everybody starts copying and pasting it. And before you know it, they start copying and pasting typos. Now everybody is sending out the same typo, and there's definitely risk there. And I know people are playing the numbers game. They're saying, if I send out 100 emails and I get 5 people to respond, I get a 5% response rate, and I can get 1 meeting out of that 5% response rate, then I'm winning. And now all I need to do, if I want to get 10 meetings, then I need to send out 1,000 of those emails. And if I send out 10,000 of those emails, I might get 100 meetings. And this is where math becomes a really, really big problem in sales. Then you get into this pseudo customized or pseudo personalized or Mad Lib personalized approach, which is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to fill in the blank associated with each of these individual items. And somebody out there has determined that, hey, if I can tell them where I heard of them, and I can send a link directly to that episode demonstrating that I actually know that it exists, and I pull up this segment that's 30 some odd seconds in or 27 minutes and 30 seconds in, I can deliver some context, and that might drive a level of engagement. And I would tell you that if somebody did that, it probably would they would at least get me to read the entire email. But usually what I'm going to do is I'm going to follow up with a question. I'm going to ask them how they applied it, or ask them how that aligns with whatever it is that they were working on, so that I can get some additional context. Many times when you ask that question, especially if it's over the phone, what you realize is they didn't actually do the work. They just found that piece and they really don't have a strong story behind it. And then to get into your third piece, the more personalized approach, this requires hard work. It can't be done at a significant volume. It requires that you take a personal interest in what people are working on and where they're focused, and take a more service-oriented approach. The personalized piece is, and we've talked about this before in the Why You Now discussion around outreach, and we'll link to that one. But the personalized piece is, here there was a compelling event. Something happened. It led me to reach out to you because of this. And then you ask for some type of call to action. And that might be, who would you recommend I speak to discuss this further? Or how can we coordinate schedules to schedule a time to discuss further? There's a couple of different calls to action, but that's just a recap of the 3 that you had talked about. When it comes to people making contact with me, or what I'd like to see is, especially if they're interested in being a guest on the podcast, or they'd like to, maybe they're interested in a job. We don't have any job postings right now, but they're interested in working with Catalyst Sale based on the content that we put out in the marketplace and the reputation that we have in the marketplace. What I want is some of that context. Why did you reach out? What was the compelling event? If you want to be a guest on the podcast, tell me a bit about what you know about our audience. We're pretty transparent about who our audience is. I think you say this at the beginning of every episode, Jody. It's whether you're in sales or not in sales, but work with sales professionals, or are in a role where you need to influence others, you'll find practical information that you can apply to your job today. I think I got that. But it's in that instance, what we're talking about is, I know who your audience is. So if I know Jody Mayberry's show, that you are drawing the correlation between what park leaders, what you can learn from working in a national park, and how that applies to leadership in the context of the workplace, I would want to share some leadership experience that I have and tie that to what I know about your audience, and why I think it would be worth at least having a discussion to see if there's the right fit. And this is an important piece, a discussion to see if there's the right fit, rather than me just ask, hey, can you put me on your podcast?
That's a great example or what you said I can think of a great example of that particular show, the Park Leader Show. Sometimes I get just random solicitations and I think, gosh, did you even realize this is a show for park rangers? Because what you talk about in your email doesn't even mention it. That's where you get the cut and paste emails or even the Mad Lib. But I got one recently from Eben Sipitkowski, who's the director of Baxter State Park in Maine. And he just laid it out that, hey, I love the show. I've been having my staff listen to it. We're doing some great things here at Baxter State Park that I think the audience would be interested in. And here's why. Here's what's a little different. And he said, would you be interested in having a call? It was almost like he had talked to Mike Simmons before he sent that email. And we actually didn't have a call before. We exchanged some email and I realized, oh yeah, I want this guy on the show. So the first time we talked was the interview with him on the show because it didn't take me long to realize. But if he had just done a cut and paste, it never would have worked out. But his email was so personal and I could tell he knew the show well. I could tell he was in a leadership position. I could tell they were doing some interesting stuff and it led to him being a guest on the show.
Yeah. So you take that, let's take that and break it down a little bit more for the audience. Like so you read through this email and you could tell that there were things that he was sharing that indicated, one, he knows what he's talking about. Two, he's got some practical experience. And three, these things will apply to the audience. What are some of the things, whether you use the specific email or just talk in general terms, what are some of the things that he identified relative to your audience that made you say, yes, this person knows what they're talking about, they understand who the audience, and they know how the content's going to be relevant?
Well, I don't have the email in front of me, or I wouldn't mind referencing it. But some things that helped is, one, I realized that he understood the show. He understood what we did. So that really helped. He had a position that allowed him to gain experience that could be helpful. So that really helped. So now I know he understands the audience. I know he knows what he's talking about. I looked him up too in the park. And then the fact that it wasn't just put me on your show. It was, I think we're doing some things here that will be of interest to your audience. Do you want to talk about it and see if it's a fit? And that, to me, even though that's simple and it just led to me saying, hey, come on the show, it just made me think, okay, he's not trying to get on the show. He's just saying, look, we're doing some great stuff here. It might be a fit for your audience. Maybe not, but let's talk about it and see. And that overcame this mental hurdle, this block that I put up because I get so many requests to be on different podcasts. But the way he approached it, it just knocked that down and said, oh, well, he's doing good stuff and he wants to see if it's a fit. Let's find out. So the way he structured that email, I knew he knew the audience. I knew he knew his stuff, even though he didn't have to talk about that much because he more talked about the team and the park and that sort of thing. But he was also the director.
Yep.
And then just the fact that he said, we're doing some great stuff. It could be a fit for your audience. Do you want to have a talk and see? And then he said, even if you don't, just know that I enjoy your show so much.
Yeah. So he's giving you a couple of outs. One out is, hey, we don't really need to take any kind of action here. Just know that I enjoyed the show and keep doing great work. Another out is, hey, Jody, you're the one who's going to determine whether or not it's the right fit. Because if it's not the right fit, then it doesn't really make sense for either of us to spend our time doing that. But the key takeaway for me from a style perspective is he's focused on building rapport, building a relationship. He doesn't need to pitch or start talking about all of the reasons why you should be the details behind. Here are the 5 things that we implemented. And I would like to share this 5-step process with your audience around how they can implement those things inside their organization too. When someone says that, it's very me focused. I want to deliver this, my 5-step, get rich, quick fix, silver bullet type approach. And so I'll share a story with you about how we reach out to potential participants in the podcast. And this is the same approach that I use when reaching out to prospects for Catalyst sale, when reaching out to prospects on behalf of the customer base or the clients that we work with. when doing market research. I'm very transparent. We are conducting market research, or I would like to have you on as a guest of the Catalyst Sale podcast. And the reason why I'd like to have you on as a guest is I've found your information that you're sharing with the market to be very interesting and aligns with a number of reoccurring themes that we're seeing across our client base or that we've seen with the sales team members that we've coached over time. Then what I also do is I provide them with a link to the podcast so that they could listen to the podcast and determine if it's the right fit, because our approach is very conversational. There are some people who would like to get the 3 questions you're going to ask scripted and delivered to them, and that's all they want to talk about. And in that kind of environment, they may not be comfortable in an open dialogue or conversation-oriented approach like we take here. So if they can self-select and say that they're not the right fit, then it helps us avoid a scenario where we bring the wrong guest on. But by giving them the ability to listen to something that already exists out there, they can make a decision on their own. And that fit is so important. How many times have you bought something that just wasn't the right fit? Try screwing in a standard, screw with a Phillips head screwdriver. You're going to be in a little bit of trouble.
I like that you gave an example on how you reach out. It reminds me of the first time I had what could be a big guest on a show. I had Chris Brogan, who's the author of several books, but at the time he had just put out Freak Show Inherit the Earth. And it's a business book. And here I was asking him to be on a podcast for park rangers. And I reached out to him and I said, look, I know this is a show about park rangers, but chapter 7 of your book is so in tune with the message I've been trying to get across. Here's why. And I assumed there would be a no because it's just kind of odd, a park ranger show, and I was asking him to be on. But I think just the fact that I read the book, because most people, here's a secret, when most podcasters have an author on their podcast, they've never read the book. But I showed that I read the book, and there was a particular part that resonated with my audience, or I felt it would, and that's why I wanted him on. And he agreed, and that helped get other people on the show too. Once they see somebody else has been on the show, they're like, oh, okay, this must be a quality show. And you've done such a great job getting a wide variety of guests on the show that just reinforces what you say, that sales is a thinking process, because you bring in all these different backgrounds. I'm getting a little off topic now, but you bring in all these different backgrounds, and the common tie to all of it is that it's a thinking process, and Catalyst Sales helped people think differently about sales. And it all comes back to how you approach people about being on the show. And I know it doesn't work every time, but it works enough for people that feel that they're the right fit to be on the show.
Yeah, I mean, listeners can go back in and look at Twitter stream between me and Bo Burlingham, and that was how we got him on the podcast. I just finished reading Small Giants and shared a couple of quotes from the book and then followed that up. When he engaged in the conversation on Twitter, I asked if he'd be interested in joining as a guest. And then we had a couple of separate side conversations to confirm that it was the right fit. But that's out there, and that you can see that outreach is public. And once we've had Bo on by the time this podcast goes live, we will have already had Bo's recording. So we all would have heard that. I think the other thing that's kind of interesting is, if you notice, we don't have a lot of salespeople on the podcast, and that's intentional. One, many of their processes and practices might conflict with how we coach people out in the marketplace. And we want to be careful that there's alignment there. We know there are no shortcuts, and we know there are no quick fixes. You have to do the work. And sales is a thinking process. So templates don't work. Guidelines and guideposts do. Having a template, though, that allows you to fill things in from a Mad Lib perspective to bring it back to that is in our experience, it doesn't work. Whether you're talking about proposals or you're talking about outreach or you're talking about presentations, things need to be personalized and based in context. And to Jody's point, the reason why we bring people who do not necessarily have a sales background or aren't in sales on the podcast is that experience that they deliver can be used to illustrate how we all sell in one way, shape, or form. We all influence others in one way, shape, or form. Her vocabulary may be a little bit different, but getting Jennifer McClure on here to talk about things from an HR perspective and a personal branding perspective, or Pam to talk about marketing, or Dave Berke to talk about the OODA Loop and feedback loops. Those are the types of guests that we'll continue to bring on, because I think they will help us all level up in our own individual professions.
Okay, now this I'm going to tie it all back together and ask you directly. We've been talking about these emails that we get for people that want to be guests on the podcast. So how does this relate to sales?
Great question. Anytime that you are conducting outreach, make it personal. Take the time to do a little bit of research. This doesn't have to be an all-day event. Take the time to do a little bit of research on the people that you're connecting with, that you're speaking with. See what they are posting on Twitter. See what they're posting on LinkedIn. See what they're sharing, or what they've shared with the general marketplace on any blogs that they've written or that they've been quoted in. Find events that they've spoken at. At a minimum, read the description of the event if you can't find a description of the session, if you can't find an actual recording of the session. When you make that outreach to others, put it in the context of, in a way that will help them connect the dots between you and them, and why you're making contact with them, and what value they may be able to get or give out of having a conversation with you. Because remember, they're trading time. You're trading your time. You're asking for information. They're trading their time. They may be giving you some information based on the questions that you have. But I would just wrap it up and say context is critical.
Context is critical. And I don't know if I've ever mentioned this on the show, but I keep a notepad with me and take notes while we're recording. And the one thing I have with stars by it based on this conversation is context matters.
Absolutely.
And this is a situation where context makes a difference. We look at all the emails that we get and we go right by them. But that one email from Eben Sipitkowski, just the context of it is what stopped me and led to him being a guest on the show. And that translates over to sales. Context matters. All right, Mike, this was a fun episode to take something that is right in front of us. And really, for me, often we get these emails very often now about being guests on the show. So I'm glad that we covered it. And I think this idea of context matters. It translates into a lot of your sales efforts, not just the emails that you send out. And if you found this to be a good episode that would benefit somebody you know, please share it with a colleague or a friend. And if you tag us on Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn, we can join in on the conversation. Thank you, Mike Simmons, and thank you for listening to the Catalyst Sale Podcast.